Hey everyone, so just a quick update. While we've all been focusing on the absolutely wild escalations in the Middle East, the conflict in Ukraine has been moving forwards, and the news from today, we're on the second of October, is that there's been mass executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war, and the Ukrainians have had to retreat from a town called Vuhledar. Now, before we go into this, guys, what I want you to do is cast your minds back to this initial invasion. Well, I say the initial invasion, to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and think about the things. And I'm not going to talk about them now, but I want you guys to think about the war crimes that were being committed in Bucha and Irpin. Now, I went into Bucha and Irpin like probably a week after the Russians were pushed out of that location, and I spoke to some of the people who were still there. In fact, I was actually on the outskirts of Irpin while the Russians were still occupying that. We couldn't get in. There was a collapsed bridge, and we ended up helping the civilians over the water. But what I will say is some of the things I heard, first-hand experience of things how the Russians treated the Ukrainians, especially how they treated the women and the girls, and what happened in Bucha. People need to be held accountable for what happened. We can't have a situation where these things can just happen and, nobody's held accountable for these things that have happened. And again, we can remember the aircraft that was shot down over Donetsk in, was it 2014? So, the Russians have got this history of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just doing bad things and lying about it. It seems to, and this brings me back to the conversation I had with my friend a couple of days ago. I keep trying to get him on I keep trying to get him on here as a guest, but this brings me back to the conversation I had with him. And he gave a different, he gave a different perspective, and he gave the perspective of that. Could it be that Vladimir Putin isn't a monster? He's just a product of a monstrous society in the Russians. And I've heard a few people say this. Normally, when you're looking at a country and they're doing bad things, you kind of look at the leadership and you think, right, they've got bad leadership and they've been pushed towards this because they've got a tyrannical leader. But I'm hearing a lot of things about the actual Russians on the ground now in Ukraine, and especially if you look at the things that happened in Bucha and Irpin. It doesn't matter how much you get ordered to do something. There's some things you just shouldn't do. It doesn't matter what international laws you're following. It doesn't matter. It's just things that a good human being wouldn't do. And I get, I've been to conflicts myself. I get that some Russian soldiers may have been pushed into a war that they didn't want to go into. I get that, and then they're made to. I totally get that. But some of the things that the Russians did to the local population in Bucha and in Irpin, I've seen the drone footage. I've seen, by drone footage, I don't mean military drone footage. I mean civilian drone footage that's not readily available or as open source. And I've spoke to people in Bucha and in Irpin about the things that happened in there, and it's absolutely catastrophic. And also the things that happened in Borodyanka as well, which is like, if you look at a map of Ukraine, it's about an hour northwest of Ukraine. About an hour northwest of Ukraine, 40 minutes to an hour, depending what the roads are like. So those are the places that, for me, I've been there and I've seen things firsthand. I've seen the absolute devastation. And it seems like when we see things on the news, people have lost taken away the human toll. And it just seems like numbers now on a screen. And I keep saying this, each one of those numbers, and like we're going to come on to in a minute, about there's 16. Again, I'm saying apparently because I've not seen the evidence. I'm reporting what mainstream media reported. So there's 16 Ukrainian prisoners of war who've, like I said, allegedly been executed. And each one of those people had a family. Each one of those people had probably homes, hopes, dreams, aspirations, you know, children, wives, you know, and it's just devastating, because if you think about the carnage and the, you know, and the upset and the misery this causes, and again, for what? The example I give is when I talk about one of the people I saw in a hospital in Ukraine. It was a young boy who was, I think he was sedated, and what had happened is he was leaving. Him and his parents were evacuating Kiev as the Russians were coming in. They got in their car and they tried to, and they either they were getting in their car or they just got in their car, and some Russians drove into Kiev and they were just shooting at people. Again, I don't know what strategic value there is in just shooting at civilians. I don't know. It shows a very poorly trained military. It really does. There's so many things wrong with that, you know, from a strategic point of view, from a hearts and minds point of view, from a, you know, why are you doing that in the first place? Have you, what part of your training do you do that? I just don't know. Anyway, this young boy, I think he was about 10 years old, and he'd been shot. He was sedated at the time. He'd not woken up. But when he woke up, he was going to find out he'd been shot in the back. He'll be paralyzed from the legs down, from the waist down, sorry. And his mum and dad are gone. So, you know, the human toll, and what did they achieve by doing that? Like, what did those people who came in, who were driving into Kiev, just blasting away, you know, at random things? What did they achieve? It's just mind-boggling. Anyway, guys, so let's get the light's gone again. Let's get straight onto the let's go straight onto this shared screen, guys, and I'll just give you the headlines of these you know, these updates that have just come out. So here we are from Russian forces execute 16 Ukrainian prisoners of war near Pokrovsk, prosecutors say. So this location, Pokrovsk, you know, it's one of those locations that's in the news. The Russians are pushing towards it, and it looks like the Russians have had a little break from pushing towards that location, but they're still the distance that the Russians are now. It means they're still well within range of most indirect fire systems. I'm talking about the main one that they'll be using will be the 120mm mortar, which can be man portable, but usually they put that in a vehicle. So that's the distance now that they are from Pokrovsk. You know, from what I'm hearing, that it's being bombarded all the time. There's indirect fire constantly, and it's looking like the Russians are just waiting to do a big push. Now, remember what we said about how the Russians work. They'll push, and then they'll hold, and then they'll bombard, and then the Ukrainians then don't know where the Russians are pushing. So they're trying to spread their troops thin. Remember, the Ukrainians are now committed into this region of Kursk, where they've pushed their soldiers. So I think this is turning out to be a double-edged sword for the Ukrainians, in the context that they've had to invest a lot of manpower into that region, and now they're laying themselves a little bit thin along the front line. That said, it looks like the Ukrainians have either held the line by Pokrovsk, or the Russians have stopped pushing. This is what we've seen historically. They'll push, then they'll stop, bombard. The Ukrainians will spread themselves out again, reformat, so they're so they have an even line, and then the Russians will make a breakthrough. Then the Ukrainians will fluster and try and plug that gap, and then they'll pause, bombard, and then they'll push through. So that's actually what's just happened, but we'll come on to that in a second. So Russian forces appear to have shot 16 Ukrainian prisoners of war in Donetsk Oblast. Oblast means like the region around. The largest recorded case of mass execution of surrendered soldiers on the battlefield, Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office said on the 1st of October. Evidence of the execution appeared on social media on the 1st of October. Prisoners of war were reportedly killed after surrendering on the front line. So it's not confirmed yet But, people are putting this out there in social media. It's on, it's being produced on a mainstream media account. So, I think it's fair that we report on it because, like I always say, nothing's hidden anymore. All the information's out there and, these guys are reporting it. So I think it's fair that I report on it as well. So what I want to switch to now, guys, is the situation in the, in the east of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have just lost another town. So while everybody was looking at Pokrovs and looking for, the Ukrainian push into Pokrovs, they've actually just lost a town of Volodya. So we'll go straight onto them. In fact, I'll tell you what's been happening. So the eastern city, I'll read straight from an article that I'll put in the description. The eastern city had resisted repeated attacks, but Russian troops are close to encircling it in the Donetsk advance. Ukraine has said that its forces have withdrawn from the eastern city of Volodar, a defensive battalion that had resisted repeated Russian attacks since Vladimir Putin's 2022 full-scale invasion. The military command in Kiev said its troops late on Tuesday they had retreated in order to preserve personnel and combat equipment. Guys, that is I think the Ukrainians should have been doing more of this and saving more of their equipment, saving more of their manpower, rather than trying to fight a futile battle where they're losing equipment, they're losing manpower, and they're losing the initiative. If you can pull back, if you can pull back in a orderly fashion, it's not a retreat. It's just a withdrawal. You can do fighting withdrawals. You can put more harassing fire on the enemy if you're still harassing them further away than if you've all been killed or captured and you have no more equipment. If you have no more soldiers, you can't be effective if you've all been captured or worse. In order to reserve personnel and combat equipment, it said, adding the Russian combat units had attacked from 3 directions and were close to encircling the city. So what they've done there is, rather than be encircled, if you remember this pincer movement that the Russians are doing, they're right now the Russians are becoming masters of this pincer movement. They will come north of a city, south of a city. They'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing until it's almost encircled. And then they'll try and close those pincers so they encircle the people inside. Once those people are encircled, there's no way out for them. They're trapped, and it's kind of game over for those people. So let's look on the shared screen, and I'll show you where this is geographically in relation to Pokrovs. So where am I looking here, guys? Right. So this is So this is let me zoom in. So this is the place here, guys. Volodar. And this was what it looked like on the 15th. So the red denotes the Russian locations. Obviously, the no color denotes it's still under Ukrainian control. So this was on the 15th of the 9th. So just over 2 weeks ago. So if you look how quickly the Russians close in, I'm just going to zoom forwards here till we are today. So you can see that's as of yesterday, the Russians have now totally taken that city. Well, not city, that town of Volodya. That was a key stronghold. It had a lot of equipment there. I'm going to suggest it still has a lot of equipment there, potentially what the Ukrainians couldn't take with them. But luckily, they managed to escape with a sufficient amount of their equipment. In relation to Pokrovs is up here. And this is the main one. This is the main one that these guys are going for. So that's Pokrovs. That's the Russian front line. And let's just give a quick measure to see how far it is, see if there's been any movement. So let's go there. Yeah, 9.6 kilometers. So that is well within range of most, company level indirect fire systems. So that's the situation in Ukraine, guys. It's every day you're seeing the Russians take more and more ground. Every day, you're seeing more and more of these things happen. The media seems to have switched fire from Ukraine to the Middle East in about 2 weeks normally. If you look back since when these conflicts started, especially after the 7/7 attack, it seems every 2 weeks there's a media shift, there's a media focus. when I don't know whether it's people get bored, whether the news cycle changes, and then we kind of forget about whatever's happening somewhere else, and then we're looking at we're looking at the other location, so things are still happening in Ukraine. The Russians are still pushing, the Russians are still grinding, and the longer this conflict goes on, the more of an advantage the Russians have, because the Russians have the manpower advantage, they have the manufacturing advantage. The allies the Russians have, I mean, first of all, China. The industrial and manufacturing capacity of China gives Russia an almost infinite supply of whatever it's getting from China. That's just the reality of that situation. If these are, like, if you look at the distance between Pokrovsk and the Russian front line, what did we say it was off the map? Like under 10 kilometers. The range of a 120 millimeter mortar, I think it's 13 kilometers. It might be 14, depending on your charge. But either way, that is still within range of 120 millimeter mortar. And those 120 millimeter mortars, they're not difficult to produce. They can be mass produced. They're easy to use. They don't need any electronics. They don't need any guidance systems. You literally throw them down a barrel, and I think you pull something, or I'm not sure, it may go off automatically, but basically you put it down a barrel and then it goes and hits the target. These things are devastating, and they can be, because of that distance now, the Russians don't need to rely on heavy artillery that's expensive. They don't need to rely on glide bombs that need to be air launched. They don't need to rely on any sophisticated communications, electronics that can be jammed or hacked or broken, or the supply chain's too sophisticated. They are literally using dumb munitions to suppress this location. Now, as we've all been looking at Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians have been pushing more manpower into Pokrovsk to try and defend it, the Russians have seen the gap and they've taken the town of Vuhledar. So the situation is getting bad. It's getting worse. Like I said, the Russians keep pushing, and the longer this goes on, the more of an advantage the Russians have, because there really isn't anything that the West can do now. The West is at full capacity with their supply of munitions into Ukraine. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to mag to grid. I'll get you guys another video. I'll get you guys another video later. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share my stuff if you feel it's relevant and you like the content. Anyway, guys, I'll speak to you soon.